I'm quite certain that most of the speakers at this wonderful event start out by thanking all of you for this incredible opportunity. I, however, intended to demand an apology. I'm serious. I have spent the last few months in agony. I have been wondering what I could possibly say to you tonight that would have any value, that would be worthy of this opportunity. I even asked one of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Ann Hamrick, if I could see the tape of when she gave the last lecture. And after seeing that tape, I sent her a very simple message. You have ruined my life. It was so inspired, it was so brilliant, it was so meaningful, so perfectly delivered that I became despondent that I could possibly talk to you in any way that would be interesting and meaningful. You see, when I'm lecturing on pathophysiology, my entire goal when talking about heart disease and pneumonia and hepatitis is to be very practical, to be very clinically applicable. So much so that I ask my students to interrupt my lectures when necessary, to raise their hands and say, "So what?" And if I can't answer their questions right away in a way that meets their expectations, I have to change the subject. So now I find myself standing before you trying to come up with something brilliant and philosophical. And I realized there was no way to do that without violating Tina's #1 rule of humility. Don't believe everything you think. So I was walking my dog a couple weeks ago, and it suddenly hit me, and I busted out laughing. I realized I had been violating Tina's #1 rule of sanity, which is the only thing you should never take too seriously, is yourself. And so I realized that the reason I'm here tonight is that I'm a teacher. That's why I'm here. So what else would I talk about but teaching? Now, I also didn't want to violate my so what rule, so I decided I'd talk to you about teaching from the perspective of a learner, and that way hopefully have some relevance and maybe some messages that might come through to all of you. Now, I see a lot of my students out there, and some of you may be surprised by this, but I did not pop out of the womb dreaming of spending 20 years standing in front of McLeod Room 2014 talking about loogies, hawkers, and bile. You know, I had to come to that. And like all of us, I've had many mentors on my winding journey to this place. And they've challenged me, they've encouraged me, and they've guided my path. Obviously, I won't be able to mention them all. You know, I didn't think it'd look too good if I whipped out one of those little pieces of paper, like at the Academy Awards, you know, and tried to read them off really fast before the music starts. So I had to be selective. Now I'm going to talk about just a few of my teachers and the lessons I learned from them. I could not give this talk without mentioning my parents, but I certainly can't do justice to them. My parents were immigrants to this country, and while they never went to college, they taught me to love reading, writing, and science. And they taught me the value of education as a way to take care of myself in this world. One of the first great teachers in my life taught me the value of really looking at people, looking closely at people, and seeking out the best of them, in them, and also the value in giving second chances. After a series of unfortunate events that are much too embarrassing to relate here tonight, I eventually ended up in Virginia, a high school dropout without a job. I don't remember where it came from, but I got a letter in the mail that said I was eligible to take my SATs, and so I did. It was shortly after that that I met the next great teacher in my life, the president of Mary Washington College. I wormed my way into his office, and I told him that he should offer me a chance at a college education based on my SATs and a promise that I would make to him that I would be successful. Now, as many of you know, the College of William & Mary, now the University of William & Mary, is a fine school. And as a president, this man had absolutely no reason to take me seriously. He had plenty of fine applicants. He didn't need me. He didn't need to take a chance on me. But he stopped being a president, and he started being a teacher again, which of course was his roots. And he pulled up a chair real close to mine, and he looked at me, and he must have seen someone there that he really thought he could help, someone in whose life he could make a difference. So he offered me conditional admission to the College of William & Mary in the hopes that I would be able to successfully get through a year. Well, I couldn't let him down, and despite the fact I didn't have much of a high school education, I eked out a B average, and after a year he gave me a diploma to a local high school that I've never seen, and shortly thereafter wrote me a letter in support of my transfer to the College of William & Mary, where I could leave my past behind and make a fresh start. Now, I want to skip ahead a little bit to tell you the rest of this story. Many years later, this now retired university professor was admitted to the coronary care unit where I was an intern, and he became my patient. Now, he didn't recognize me when he first came in, but I sure recognized him. And once he was stabilized and able to speak comfortably, I reminded him of how he had changed my life, of the gift he had given me. He seemed touched by this, but he didn't stay in that place very long. He switched right back to being a teacher, and he looked real closely at me, and he started talking about what it was like to be old and ill and dying, and to be cared for by someone young enough to be his granddaughter. I'll never forget the changes he made in my life, and I affectionately call that chapter in my life my dirtball to doctor story. In medical school, but even more so during my internal medicine residency, I learned from my next great teacher, Dr. Ed Hook, chairman of the Department of Internal Medicine. There are quite a few of us still around here who trained under Dr. Hook, and we proudly call ourselves Hook residents. What that means is that we were trained to always put the patient first. Times were different then, and sleep deprivation and 100-hour work weeks were the norm. I'm not here to debate the merits or drawbacks of that, but I can tell you that I and many of my classmates and resident mates underwent real personality changes. And it would have been easy to become cynical and uncaring in my approach to patients. After all, every new patient problem was just that much more work for me and that much less sleep. But what I learned from Ed Hook was a tremendous sense of responsibility and pride in providing the very best care possible for all of my patients. He cut no slack. He was unrelenting in his efforts to make us rise to his high standards of care. He taught me the value of doing whatever it takes to be the best you can be, especially when someone is depending on you. No excuses. I had another group of incredible teachers during my training. They were the nurses who decided that although I had a lot to learn, there was some small hope I might someday become a decent physician, so they decided to be nice to me. Now, some of you may not know this, but at least back in those days, all medical students learned about nurses is you better be nice to them or they'll hurt you. But times were already changing, and these brilliant professional nurses patiently and generously shared their expertise and their deep understanding of what it means to really care for patients. They also taught me what it really means to be a colleague, We would sit at the nursing station and eat together, laugh together, cry together, and make fun of each other. One night, we noticed that Mr. S., our demented patient with leukemia and very little immunity, was no longer pacing the unit like he always did. And that Mrs. K., our demented patient down the hall with Pseudomonas pneumonia, was no longer making these high little rootling noises that she made all night. So we went down to Mrs. K's room, and sure enough, there they were, curled up in bed, fast asleep. I knew we were really starting to think like a team when we all looked at one another and wished for nothing more than that we could leave them there, just happily asleep. And then in the next moment, we looked at each other and immediately thought of what would happen if Jayco or the families came in at that moment. So we all jumped up and got the patients back in their stations as soon as we could. But we also got together and talked about innovative and special ways that we might work together to help Mrs. K and Mr. S find some peace during their hospitalization. The nurses with whom I have been so privileged to work taught me that as long as each member of the team is dedicated to achieving the same goals and brings all of his or her best to the endeavor, amazing things can be accomplished and rich bonds can be made. I realized I loved intensive care and ended up getting a National Research Service Award to pursue a clinical and research fellowship in pulmonary medicine. There I met another teacher named Ed. This guy was named Ed Rose. Dr. Rose was my research sponsor, and let me tell you, he was one tough son of a gun. He taught me that research is a passionate commitment to the truth and that there is no such thing as a fudge factor. He also taught me an important but unintended lesson when he worked me 12 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, doing tedious bench research, and then announced one morning that if I didn't leap out of bed the next day, anxious to get back to the bench, that I should reconsider my choice as being a researcher. This taught me that sometimes it's okay to say, whoops, I have made a mistake, to walk away and to let it go. But I was only able to really do that because while I was Ed Rose's fellow, he taught me the importance of doing my best every day, even when I was doing something I didn't really enjoy. He made me a really good researcher, so that when I walked away, I knew it was not because I could not do it, but because I didn't choose to do it. And that's a pretty important lesson. My NRSA let me pay back my medical school scholarship in 2 ways. One was by doing primary care to an underserved community, and the other was by teaching. So I went into private practice in beautiful downtown Dillwyn, Virginia, and started teaching in the School of Nursing here at the University of Virginia. Irv, my physician partner in the practice in Dillwyn, was living in the house he was born in. His wife was the lab tech, his mother the receptionist, his dad the handyman, and his cousin the insurance secretary. He was an outstanding diagnostician and taught me much about primary care. But he was not my real teacher there. My real teacher in Dillwyn were my patients. Buckingham County was then the poorest county in the state. Many of us here have never really experienced it from our privileged perspective, but these people were really poor. But they taught me the meaning of caring for family and friends in times of need. They taught me about courage in the face of despair. They taught me about real strength, and they taught me to look beyond appearances and first impressions. Mrs. T was a 70-year-old widow who came to my clinic always looking like she just stepped out of the beauty parlor, hair coiffed, dress without a wrinkle, shiny shoes. She got real sick one day and I made a house call. Turns out Mrs. T lived in a one-room shack without running water. Only then did I think back and realize that she wore the same wrinkle-free dress and the same shiny shoes every time I saw her in clinic, and there they were hanging on a nail, the only one she had. She got all dressed up to come out to see me because even though she had no money, no family, and no real hope, Mrs. T still had pride. Most of the men in my practice were incredibly stoic in front of their families and friends, but once I closed the doors and got to know them a little bit, they would often open up and tell me some of their deepest concerns. Mr. J came to me only because his wife nagged him to come, which is pretty typical in Buckingham. She was a small, sort of faded brown kind of person. Faded brown hair kind of person, sorry. Just kind of small, if you know what I mean. And she spoke very softly, and she wouldn't look me in the eye. He, however, worked fixing the big logging trucks that moved the trees to the mill. And after much prompting, finally confessed that he was a little tired lately, that he was having trouble using this huge wrench that he used to work on the logging trucks. At first glance, he was a powerfully built 38-year-old with a thick beard, a shock of curly hair, piercing dark brown eyes, standing tall with his arms crossed and refusing to sit on the examining table. On closer inspection, he was pale, he was sweaty, and he was trembling slightly. After a physical exam and some simple lab tests, I had to tell this man that he had acute leukemia, and he was going to have to go directly from the clinic to the hospital. That big, strong man turned to his small wife, and with a look of complete bewilderment that gradually turned to fear and to grief. In a matter of moments, the man that had ruled himself and his family with an iron hand was in desperate need. And you know what? His wife stepped right up to the plate. I swear she grew 4 inches. She stood up tall, she lifted her head, and she took him by the hand. Over the next 8 months of chemo, and then bone marrow transplant, and then relapse, she took care of him with a depth of strength and courage that none of her family had ever seen before. She communicated with the healthcare staff. She stayed with him as much as she could. She took care of all the family business, and she told him she loved him every day. The giant man I had known dwindled down to be a frail, almost translucent being who spoke gently and spent his last days making me a birdhouse. He gave me the birdhouse on Thursday, and he died on Sunday. His wife was there. She thanked me for what I'd done. She shook my hand, and she left, and I never saw her again. But her lessons of courage and loyalty have stayed with me always. My patients also taught me the importance of clear communication. Take Mrs. H, for example. Mrs. H was a 51-year-old grandmother of 6 who came in complaining of symptoms of episodic sweating, palpitations, and the episodic urge to tear off all of her clothes in public. So I asked Mrs. H, I asked, have you been through the menopause? And she paused for a moment thoughtfully and said, if it's between here and Scottsville, I have. Or take Mrs. R, an 89-year-old who came in with a twisted knee. I suggested that she take a bag of frozen peas to use as a conforming ice pack to try and reduce the swelling. An hour later, I got a call from her son. Dr. Brashers, did you tell my mama to put peas on her knees? Sort of. Because if you did, she cooked them up and she can't get them to stay, and she was wondering if she could use mashed potatoes instead. That's a true story. Yeah, my patients taught me so many lessons. And although I left my practice to become a full-time teacher, in my heart, I will always be their cute little dark-haired doctor, bless her heart. Since becoming a teacher myself, I've had amazing mentors and teachers, both professional and personal. Dr. Doris Greiner taught me about the value of creativity in teaching. Dr. Sharon Utz taught me how quiet, steady support can lead to success. Dr. Courtney Leider taught me to think positively and not to sweat the small stuff. Dr. Patty Gray taught me to be open-hearted and honest in all my interactions with people. Ms. Erin Crougy taught me how genuine kindness can be combined with an iron will to make a real difference. Mr. Quinn Robinson taught me to look for real joy in everything I do and to share that joy with others. Ms. Renee Breeden taught me how much it means to have a steady friend who I can count on every day. So many teachers, and not nearly enough time to talk about them all. So I'm going to focus on 3 teachers I've had since coming to the School of Nursing. The first is Dr. Eugene Corbett. Dr. Corbett practiced in Buckingham County too, only he was a real family doc. He worked there for many years. He's now a full professor in both the School of Medicine and the School of Nursing, and he is my most revered role model and mentor. Gene was the first one to give me an opportunity to teach in the School of Nursing when I was a pulmonary fellow, and we've been co-teaching pathophysiology at the undergraduate and graduate level for over 20 years. He's taught me many things about teaching. For example, he taught me that it's possible to ask really hard test questions and still be beloved by the students. Yeah, his Corbett questions are infamous, and the only time that I have a problem with it is when he's not there to do the post-exam reviews and I have to wear my asbestos underwear to keep from being burned alive by the students. But much more importantly, Gene taught me what it means to teach from both your heart and your head. Sure, it's important to be an expert in what you're teaching. It's important to be organized in your presentation. But it's at least important to be passionate in your desire to help students truly learn the material. You can't just get up there and focus only on getting the content right. You have to make the most of every moment that you have with your students and give it all you've got. The second teacher at the School of Nursing I have to credit is my dean, Jeanette Lancaster. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you know that doctors and nurses haven't always gotten along perfectly. And to have a doctor be a full-time faculty member in a School of Nursing is unusual, if not unique. But Dean Lancaster never seemed to bat an eye at my being a doctor. She saw some potential in me as a teacher and gave me all the support I could possibly need to be successful. Even more amazing than that, she has given me many opportunities to represent the School of Nursing in many venues, including to donors. this has resulted in sometimes unexpected results. You see, I remember once, very early on in my career, teaching at the School of Nursing, the dean was showing some prospective donors around the school and wanted to show them our auditorium. And I happened to be in the auditorium teaching master's pathophysiology and giving an exam. It also happened to be Halloween. I offered my master's students 2 points on the exam if they would wear a costume. And of course, I fully expected them to come with maybe a cheap thing of CVS, you know, a little mask or something. They came decked out. Decked out. Of course, my first thought is, what would we have done for 5 points? But anyway, so, you know, not to be outdone, I thought I was going to be the really great one because I came as Elvis, replete with sideburns and sequins and bell bottoms and chest hair. So I'm standing up on the stage as Elvis, and I look up and the back door's open, and here comes the dean with these 2 stately gray-haired donors, right? And there I am as Elvis teaching a room full of witches, ninjas, you know. And the dean paused, and she stared, and then she quickly ushered them right back out the door. Instead of giving me a hard time later, though, she just laughed out loud and told me that the donors were impressed. One of the many lessons Dean Lancaster taught me was how you should make the most of what you have to work with. Really to look honestly at the tools that you have, their strengths and weaknesses, and find ways to make them work together in ways that achieve the results that you want. She also taught me that encouragement and support and consensus building make for optimal outcomes and enduring changes. She has always made me feel a valued and an important part of the School of Nursing, and in doing so has given me a long and rewarding career. Perhaps the most important lesson she taught me is that what I most want for my role as a teacher is to help my students learn to use their tools most effectively. And the way to help them to achieve their highest goals is by not only giving them honest feedback, but also support and encouragement. Making my students feel valued and important is a central part of my teaching philosophy. Okay, after all that, I'm going to finally get to talk to you about the most important teacher of them all, my students. Last fall, I realized I had been standing in the same room, giving the same introductory comments to my third years longer than they have been alive. That was not a happy day. You know, I go in there thinking I'm still kind of cool, you know, even at my age. And then I do a reality check, and I imagine those little thought balloons over their heads, you know, and they're thinking things like, look at that one, she's at least 10 years older than my mother. Or, she's so old, she talks about a TV show called Bonanza. Have you ever heard of that? Or, I didn't think people still wore pants and shoes like that, and she wears them every day. One of the important lessons my students taught me has to do with Tina's number 2 rule of humility, which is there is always more that you don't know than you know. It seems like an age ago when I stepped up to the podium in McLeod ready to give my very first lecture to the master's students. I was smart enough to start with a lecture on pulmonary disease, thinking I would know enough about that to be credible, right up until I looked down, and most of the students in the first 2 rows were all the ICU nurses who taught me everything important I know about taking care of pulmonary patients. So I was really nervous, and I worked my way past the shaky voice, and after about a half hour, I was doing pretty good. I was getting my groove on, you know? This teaching stuff's not so hard. Right up until somebody asked me a question about which I knew something, but not enough. So I fudged. Whole first 2 rows. Yep, they'd brought their BS repellent. So I learned from them something that all good teachers know, which is, my, that was an excellent question. Why don't you look that up and bring that to us tomorrow? Even after all these years, I feel young and energized when I walk into the room. How can that be? Well, some reasons are obvious. First of all, my students are truly brilliant, and in contrast to many of my college buddies who majored in Frisbee, they actually care about learning, so teaching them is really easy in that way. But there are other perks. For example, all I have to do is show a picture of my beloved mountains out west, and they all say, ooh, ah. All I have to do is assume my "this might be on the exam" voice, and they will write down anything I say. Anything. How cool is that? They also make me laugh, not just occasionally, but practically every day. As teachers, we all have too many stories to count, but I can't resist telling you just a few of my favorites from just this year. Dr. Brashers, I'm thinking about being sick for the midterm next Wednesday. That's true. Yep. Dr. Brashers, I'm not doing very well in your class, and I realize it's the day before the final exam, but do you think buying the textbook would help? True story, okay? And the ever popular Dr. Brashers, Sally and I are going to the beach tomorrow when we're having class, and we were just wondering if you were going to talk about anything important. And if you were, could you run through it right now? Because we don't want to miss anything important. True story. So they remind me again about Tina's #1 lesson in sanity: never take yourself too seriously. And the laughter they bring teaches me that teaching is a joy to be treasured. Perhaps for me, the most meaningful lesson I've gotten from my students is the lesson that what we do together does matter. Just before January 1st, 2000, in an effort to avoid any millennium crashes, I backed up all of my lecture outlines, PowerPoints, articles, book chapters on CDs. It made a stack 4 inches tall. How disheartening. An entire academic career that's 4 inches tall. But my students teach me every day that what we learn in the School of Nursing is meaningful and valuable, not just to one another, but to lots of others as well. Nursing students are unique. A nursing degree confers upon its graduates an incredible amount of responsibility. Few are asked to do so much right after graduation. To step right into a world in which he or she is asked to take on so much responsibility for the health, the well-being, the very life of other human beings. The power to do good, the power to do harm, the power to give, the power to withhold, the power to step into the most intimate and frightening places and be there when you're needed most. My students have looked deep into the very soul of grief and loss, stood there and taken in all the anger and the pain and the blame that comes with illness and with death. Stand there and take it all in and give back nothing but compassion and care. They set the bar high every day, and by their example motivate me to work hard to meet that responsibility. My students teach me that the privilege of being a teacher requires and allows me to do something that can matter to someone other than myself. That perhaps is the greatest lesson of all. So I do want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, after all, for this opportunity to offer my last lecture. Thank you for allowing me to think back on all my amazing teachers and all the lessons I have learned. And thank you, most of all, for giving me the chance to rededicate myself to being the kind of teacher that might make a difference in someone else's life. Thank you.